And certainly Jesus is going to come back and reign as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, is He not? I'm teaching through the book of Revelation. We're coming up on Revelation 18 here in a few weeks, and I'm moving towards Revelation 19. And when you read the return of Christ, when He descends and He calls for the birds of the sky to come and feast upon the bodies of kings and commanders, I mean, that's a pretty vivid image when He has returned and defeated the armies, right? And certainly Christ will take that role. And I think that's the image that Peter would like to see. But to see Jesus here as a humble servant, I think is an image that Peter really has a hard time with. And by the way, I think people go the other way too. I think some people don't have a hard time seeing Jesus as a humble servant. I think some people can accept Jesus that way. I think sometimes people have a hard time seeing Jesus the other way. I've found that when I'm teaching through Revelation, and when I get to Revelation 19, a lot of times people are like, man, that's so heavy. Man, that's a hard Jesus. I don't know. All that blood? Really? He's calling those birds to do that? Really? I don't know. Yeah, that's the same Jesus. You know, He came first as the suffering servant. And when He returns as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And He will reign. And He will rule the nations with a rod of iron. It's not rainbows and butterflies. You know? But I think in this context here, I think Peter has a hard time with this image. I think he has a hard time accepting Jesus here in this role of a humble servant. And I think it explains his very emphatic response here, "Never shall you wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Of course, Peter doesn't want to hear that. Now, Peter's one to open his mouth. I mean, that's typical of Peter, you know. Peter often said, I think, what the other disciples often thought. You know, but Peter was just always the one to open his mouth. Peter was honest to a fault, but he was honest. Peter gets hit, I think, hard a lot of times by a lot of pastors, but I think he had a good heart. And I like Peter in a lot of ways. But the Lord rebukes him. He challenges his thinking here. He says, look, he says that Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." And I think the idea here is that you have no fellowship with me. The word part here translates the Greek word meros. And I think it's the idea of participation. You have no participation or fellowship with me. Another context with that would be 2 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 14 through 15. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, I said 16, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 15, which reads, it says, "And do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness, or what harmony has Christ with Belial, or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever?" So the idea here of meris is the idea of fellowship. In other words, if I don't wash you, you have no fellowship with me here. And I think the idea is not one of salvation, it's one of fellowship. It's not that Jesus is offering to save Peter. Peter's already saved. It's the idea that foot washing here is analogous to restoration of fellowship. We would understand it as analogous to 1 John 1:9. That when we think of walking through the world and collecting dust on our feet, it's the idea of living in the devil's world and committing sin, such that the foot washing becomes analogous to 1 John 1:9. And we'll move on. We'll see this here. Moving on to verse 9. It says, "And Simon Peter said to him," and of course he overstates the matter. "Simon Peter said to him, 'Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head.'" I mean, if you're going to clean me, let's just do the whole thing. Of course, Peter goes overboard. And that's typical Peter. Jesus said to him, now Jesus is very clear. Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet." Now Jesus uses two words here. The word for washing is the word nipto. Nipto, N-I-P-T-O. And nipto means to wash a part of the body. In this case, the feet. Whereas the word bathe means to wash the whole body. Now, washing here would be analogous to salvation. And so when he says here, when Jesus says in verse 10, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, that is saved, but not all of you. Uh-oh. Who's he talking about? Oh, you guys are reading ahead. For he knew the one who was who? Betraying him. And for this reason he said, not all of you are clean. Strong indication that Judas is not saved. Which raises some very interesting theological questions. Because Judas was among the disciples who went out with the gospel message, wasn't he? Did people get saved? Wasn't Judas among those who went out with the power to heal? And yet he was an unbeliever. Interesting. And yet he was among the 12 that Jesus chose to be among the disciples. He was a disciple close to Jesus, heard the teaching, and yet never believed in him. But he had a role to play, didn't he? He was to betray the Lord. And so Christ said, for this reason he said, not all of you are clean. Verse 12, and so when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at table again, and he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. Now catch this, because he goes back to that issue of who is greatest. You call me teacher and Lord. That's a great position. So he captures that here in the discussion. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, that is the one who is greater in your estimation, if I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. Christ is the role model for the Christian. Now, there are some churches that practice foot washing. I certainly don't think that that is an ordinance to be practiced in the church. But the example of being willing to serve others as Christ served in humility, self-sacrificial humility. I think that's the point. Several verses. Ephesians 4:32. Ephesians 4:32. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other because you're forgivable. That's not what it says. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you. Right? Forgiving each other. Be kind to one another. And I love those one another. That alelon, that reciprocal pronoun that appears exactly 100 times in the New Testament. Love one another, pray for one another, encourage one another. And by the way, those commands can only be fulfilled within the context of the Christian community, within the church community. because it's those one another, to love one another, pray for one another. But if you're outside the Christian community, you can't fulfill those commands. It's only within the context of the church. So, love those all alone commands. Philippians 2, 3 through 8. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. And why put that in there? Except that that is the propensity of the sinful nature to be that way. It is our human nature to be that way, to be selfish, to be self-centered. I mean, it's that way from a very child, right? I mean, children grow up. Their very nature is to be selfish. You don't have to teach them to be selfish. You have to teach them to be good, right? But he says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. Boy, that would solve a lot of marital problems. That would solve a lot of church problems, business problems. With humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. And do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. And have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. I love the passage over in 1 Peter 5:5 as well. I couldn't help but think of that passage. 1 Peter 5:5. He says, you younger men likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. And the verb there, if I remember correctly, I don't have my Greek text in front of me, I think it's in the middle voice. Do it to yourself. The active voice, subject produces the action of the verb. Passive voice, subject receives the action of the verb. Middle voice, subject participates or acts upon himself. In other words, humble yourself. Humble yourself. Did Christ humble himself? Yes. It wasn't forced on him. It wasn't forced on him. He willingly rose up from his chair and laid aside his garments and took on the towel and got down and he washed the disciples' feet. It was a choice that he made. He was willing to humble himself and take upon himself this role of a servant. The infinite Creator God, that he would do this thing, the Lord of glory, that he would descend into this world and take upon himself humanity and walk in this world and live righteously under the law. And in this upper room that he would kneel down and wash the disciples' feet and offer them this teaching that would sustain them after his death, and then go to the cross and die on their behalf. Such love and such humility. It's unfathomable. And this is the greatness of our Lord, that he should humble himself and do this thing. Christ is our role model. It is so hard to imagine his love and the price that he paid and the humility that he showed. And I can't imagine what the disciples must have been thinking after he got up and put his clothes back on. Were they humbled? What happened to their discussion about who was greatest? Was there silence in the room? I suspect